The last few months have seen a parade of retractions, apologies, and resignations, which has hurt the credibility of the theory of global warming put forward by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The bad news for climate change advocates has been good news for my guest, Dr. Timothy Ball, one of the world's foremost global warming skeptics. Welcome.
Thank you, Peter.
Well, I don't have to tell you that people who criticize or question the theory of global warming come under attack. So before we talk about the science and the revelations, we have a half hour to talk. Let's just get across your background, your credentials. Your critics have lobbied everything from you're on the take with the oil industry to your academic credentials aren't credible, that you're not a climate scientist, you're a geologist. What's your background and who backs your research?
Well, I've been under attack, and we're almost at the stage in society now where the more someone's attacked, the more they're obviously onto something. And the personal attacks are a measure of that, and I knew that because I was one of the few that they couldn't say, well, you don't know your science, you don't know what's going on. They never asked that of Al Gore, by the way. But to answer your question about background, I was in the Canadian military for 9 years and, of course, studied weather. In fact, gave weather briefings as an operations officer. And then I got interested in that, lost my flying category, didn't want to fly a desk, so I went back to university. And I thought, well, study weather and climate, that's a nice quiet area to get into. And, of course, at that time, global cooling was the consensus.
Right.
And
this is back in the 60s?
Late 60s and the 70s, because it cooled from 40 to 80. And so I got a BA honors at the University of Winnipeg, and then a master's at the University of Manitoba, and a PhD at the University of London, England.
But your PhD is in geography?
The PhD is it was in the geography department because there were only two places in the world that were actually teaching climatology at that time, which shows how new an area it is. But my actual doctoral thesis was in climatology, and it was actually issued through the Faculty of Science.
So you approach all this from scientific rigor, not from a political standpoint?
No, and in fact, they say, well, he's just a historical climatologist. One of the reasons that I got into that was because we had so little data. Unless you know what was going on in the past, you can't possibly start to determine what the mechanisms are. And so my objective was to try and create an accurate, scientifically accurate, long-term data set. And I had the good fortune that the Hudson Bay Company brought thermometers and barometers to Canada very, very early. They had them at Churchill in 1768. But not only that, but they kept daily weather logs. And so I was able to code that into a series of data, which I could then do computer analysis on.
Let's talk about the data in a moment, but what about the argument that skeptics like you and others are funded and supported by oil companies or others who have a vested interest in putting forth the argument that climate change isn't happening?
Okay, first of all scientists are skeptics, so that amused me when they called me a skeptic. If you're not a skeptic, you're not a scientist. The argument about funding, of course, is one of the things that was part of the ad hominem attacks. If you can't defeat the argument, the science of it, then you attack the individual and say they're in the payoff. The argument was that I was paid by the oil companies. I've never received a nickel. The very tenuous connection they made was that there were a group of professional scientists in Alberta who knew what was going wrong with the science, wanted to form a group, and I met with them in Calgary about 10 years ago, Friends of Science, and I warned them at that time, look, you're going to be charged with being paid by the oil companies. First, you're from Alberta. Some of you worked in the oil patch. Right. You keep your funding at arm's length from you, and we actually did it through the University of Calgary, so we didn't know what the funding was. It turned out that an oil company had put some money into that pot, and I believe it was about 7% of the total monies they received. And so that was used then to say, well, we were in the pay of the oil company. I didn't know about it till much later. And I mean, the amount of money was just so small, it was just laughable. And of course, when you look at that, the funding thing is very interesting because when you look at people that are funded by the alternate energy companies who benefit from CO2 being a problem, or government funding, which has been very, very deliberately directed in Canada to one side of the argument through Environment Canada.
Well, it seems like, it is such a tense issue that any, whether it's called a mistake or whatever it is, any glitch in the argument is jumped upon. I think the emails that came out recently is a perfect example. In the winter, some emails came out that showed that the supporters of the global warming theory were basically kind of hiding data that looked suspicious.
Oh, sure.
Now, just because they did that doesn't mean that the theory is wrong, right?
No.
If there are some scientists who may have been cooking the books.
And, and that was the Climatic Research Unit in East Anglia, and I happened to get help from my doctoral thesis by Hubert Lamb, who was the founder of that. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is one of the major funders of that unit was Shell Oil. And the same thing that the Suzuki Foundation gets money from three energy companies, 2 oil companies. So, you start playing that kind of game. First of all, you're assuming the person would sell their soul, and there's a bit of an outrage in that. And the second is that ultimately it's the facts, it's the science that determines, and not who funds it.
Well, let's go through some of the facts. One of the facts that climatologists have pointed out is that in the previous century, 1900 to 2000, the Earth's temperature went up about 0.5 degree centigrade. Is that a fact or no?
No, that's not a fact. And in fact, it's one of those bits of data that was manipulated by the people at the CRU. Phil Jones, the director, who's now been set aside and is under investigation, was the one that produced that number. The actual number he produced that was in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report was 0.6 degrees Celsius since the end of the 19th century. When he was asked how did you get that number? Which weather stations did you use? How did you adjust the data? He refused to disclose it. And in fact, even though what went on at CRU has been disclosed, he's still refusing to disclose that data. So that number is really, really open to question. And not only that, but when you look at the 20th century, there were periods of warming. In fact, the greatest period of warming was from 1900 to 1940. And then from 40 to 80, the world cooled down. So there was the temperature changes going on. Overall in that century, there was more periods of cooling than there were of warming. And of course, since even Jones is now admitting that since 1998 the world's been cooling down, which of course goes completely against the theory that it's caused by CO2.
Right. Well, we have to take a break, but computer models have predicted that it's going to continue to rise up to 6% in this century. Polar ice caps melting. Lots more to talk about with Dr. Timothy Ball after this short break.